So if somebody is lucky enough to maybe start to recognize, okay, this resonates, this feels like this could be, you know, contributing to my experience of life, and then they are lucky enough to find someone and they can get an assessment, what does that assessment involve?
Okay, well, I mean, I can only talk about what I do because, believe it or not, there aren't that many people out there doing it. And it's only just now that we are starting to talk to each other more. So there's recently been a network from an organization called NAPLIC, which largely has worked with children and families of children and professionals that work with children with DLD in the past. And then we set up a network for adult DLD recently so that we can try and bring some of these groups together of people that were working with DLD in different settings so that we can share, you know, the resources that we have and the approaches that we use. But the approach that I use, and you know, this would be a sort of standard part of an assessment, but this is how I've evolved it over the years from working with adults with DLD. Perhaps the most important part of the assessment is the interview. So really asking them about their history, really, what there was like at school, you know, what are the things that they struggle with in the everyday life, really, and in terms of language and communication, what are their strengths, you know, and what are their aspirations and what's, you know, stopping them achieving those. So I get so much information from that, from people with DLD. They're often very self-aware and can tell me all about these things, although it may literally be the first time anyone's ever asked them. So I would take quite a lot of background history. Sometimes people have to ask their families about that. And I do ask somebody that knows them well to also give some information about what it's like to communicate, because obviously it's a bit different communicating with me. They're in a specific sort of situation. And whereas, you know, members of their family or friends might have seen them in a whole range of different situations and see what it's actually like in real time when people are trying to communicate. And then I give them some language tasks, which put their language under a bit of pressure to kind of see what happens when in those situations that might be reflect how they manage in everyday life, and see what their responses are, how they feel when they're doing it, you know, what the feelings that brings about, because that can tell you so much. It's not just about what they say or how they respond to the question, but like, are they feeling massively stressed? Are they getting anxious around that sort of situation? And does that make them think of other things in their everyday life? So it's really a combination of those things.
Wow. Yeah. I mean, that's great, because I think when you ask that kind of question, so often people are expecting like, well, this is the criteria and this is the tests that we do to assess against each of those criteria. And with like so many of these neurodevelopmental differences, it's more complex than just a set of criteria, and we are still learning as a society about all of them. So I think it's really good that you take so much of that into an assessment.
And just to say that there really sort of aren't any standardized tests for adults with DLD across the adult span.
Wow.
So, you know, that's why we've sort of gone back to the basics, really, of like, what, you know, how do you find out about someone's communication? Yeah. And that's one of the good things about it.
I mean, I knew this, but listening to you talking about it, it really is quite shocking the little that there is for adults with DLD. Like, if we were getting this completely right for children, then you might understand this. But at what point do we go, oh, they need to understand this about themselves? You know, this is going to really help them until they get to this point in time. And then when they're old enough, actually, there's literally nothing there. It's terrible, really. And yeah, I'm not surprised you're so passionate about getting the word out, because we're in dire need of it.
And what I would just sort of highlight there is one of the problems is the lack of speech and language therapy services and support within secondary education. So sometimes the children will get it in primary education, but it tends to often fall off in secondary education. And that's the key time when the language demands get more, they get greater in secondary education. So sometimes people don't even get picked up to that stage because they've maybe been able to manage until that stage. Those are the times, obviously, when you're a teenager, when your sort of whole kind of sense of self is being like really developed. So if you're really struggling with things and you start thinking that you're stupid because you can't, manage the things in class, those are when those ideas sort of get very sort of grow. And then if there's less services, then it's less of a tendency to pick up that people have got those difficulties, and so therefore you're less likely to get a diagnosis. So it's a sort of knock-on problem, an overall lack, particularly at secondary education. And then if you haven't got it by then, like you say, once you leave school, then that's it.
Wow. Yeah, it's wild to me, because my experience at the moment has been in primary, and what I see is definitely not something that's working in primary either, but it's there to some degree. There are some things there for early years. It is alarming that it just gets worse and worse and worse as you go through.
Yeah, I mean, I would say I don't want to like totally write off like college and FE. There are some services within college, so there's a chance that you might get assessed there. What tends to happen with a lot of people with DLD is if they do manage at some point in their lives, maybe not straight after they leave college, but they then manage to get to university, that's when it gets picked up that they've got some difficulties, because of course then the language demands go right up. And then generally what happens is they get referred for a psychological assessment. Psychologists are not qualified to assess for DLD, and only speech and language therapists are. And often, again, the psychologists don't know where to refer to people to, or there isn't anywhere to refer them to. So that's where it stops. So what quite often happens is people will be assessed because they've picked up that they're struggling. They're quite often identified as having dyslexia, because dyslexia, and there's a huge crossover between dyslexia and DLD. But often it may be missed, as you've said, that like actually underneath the dyslexia is DLD, or maybe they don't have dyslexia at all, but in fact what they have is DLD, but the person that assessed them wasn't qualified to assess for that. So that's another route. And another way that things can turn out.
It's so fascinating. And I was going to ask you about support if someone was diagnosed, but I'm just going to pause that question for a second, because you've just mentioned dyslexia. I think it'd be a really good time to talk about the co-occurrence, or if there is co-occurrence between DLD and other neurodevelopmental differences, and what that looks like.
Absolutely. So I think we're all realizing that actually co-occurrence is, almost more the norm than non-co-occurrence. So it's very common for people to have other neurodevelopmental conditions alongside their DLD. So about sort of percentages wise, there's evidence to suggest that about 60% of people with dyslexia also have DLD, which is pretty huge. There are also about a third of people with DLD have dyspraxia, which is another condition which I feel is not sufficiently, people are not sufficiently aware of. In terms of ADHD, about 40 to 50% of people with ADHD have DLD as well. They're very common bedfellows. In terms of, you mentioned autism earlier, so there is a slightly, it's not really so much controversial as slightly complex relationship in how it's talked about. So if you're autistic, you may well have what's called a language disorder as well. So there's a slight difference in the terminology. So when the term DLD was decided on in 2017, it was decided that there were certain conditions which would mean that would be described slightly differently, just because it was felt that there would be likely, it might manifest itself in a slightly different way, because the combination of those conditions and actually how you would work with someone in that situation might slightly differ. So people that have got what's called a biomedical condition, and within that is included a sensory neural deafness, hearing impairment, autism, or a learning disability plus other conditions, then it's called that thing associated with a language disorder. Although a lot of people are now, it's problematic, the terminology, and a lot of people are now just saying and. So it's like you might be autistic, but really just, you might not have a difficulty with those things, largely with the sort of things I'm talking about in DLD. But you might have that as well, and it's quite common to have that combination of things. So a lot of people, I think one of the big differences in how autistic people may present and may manage life may be because they actually have an additional language disorder. And that is giving them a whole other level of things to manage, their understanding and their ability to express themselves. There's about I haven't got any statistics about co-occurrence, but about 2.3% of the population are thought to be autistic and or have a sensory neural hearing impairment or a learning disability and a language disorder.
Oh, interesting.
But just to say also, other things occur. There is a hugely increased or quite significantly increased risk of mental health conditions in DLD, particularly anxiety and depression. And it's, I think, unclear as to how much that's just something that people are born with, or if that's just the result of some of the things that I'm talking about, years of, struggling and masking. And people with DLD can have additional speech disorders. So they may stammer, they may have difficulties with their voice, they may have difficulties with particular speech sounds, but that's sort of in addition to their DLD. So a lot of co-occurrence there, as you see.
Yeah, and again, it just further highlights the complexity of all of this. And it's really interesting hearing you talk actually about, I hadn't known that it was, I knew about it being autism with a language disorder. I didn't realize it was some of those other differences as well, which is, I find really interesting. And I think the way you explained it is really clear. And I think my perception is that this will change again over time, how people frame it and the kind of categorization and how it all looks. And I think this, beyond language disorders and other neurodevelopmental differences, I think we could arguably see a change across lots of different ones over the next few decades. So it's not necessarily about how it is and how it isn't, it's how it's labeled right now and how it isn't for me. And I think just because that I find the autism with an associated language disorder problematic, because the way you've described it is clear to me, but when people don't understand that description of it, they assume also, and also some professionals will kind of term it as it's a language disorder as a result of them being autistic, or it's somehow connected to them being autistic. And that's the bit I've got the problem with, because that then doesn't really look at the language disorder in its own right and say, what is this stuff that is really impacting this child or adult that we need to start to address. I think it's such an interesting area, and I really do think it will change. There's almost no right or wrong, because of when we go back to what we talked about at the beginning with the autism and ADHD had to be separate before, and now you can get both. And I think there's so many common traits across lots of the different differences that you could arguably rejig them all and recategorize them all and have a whole different picture, but we still have individuals facing different experiences and challenges in life that we need to get our heads around a little bit more.
Absolutely.
So let's move on to kind of support, both that DLD, people with DLD can access if they have a diagnosis, in terms of therapies or whatever else that looks like from your perspective, and then we'll move on to actually kind of from an allyship perspective, kind of what other people can do to support them. But first of all, what's available to someone with DLD in terms of support after a diagnosis?
Well, very little.
Positive spin. Be realistic.
Okay, so as I said, you can there isn't any NHS post-diagnostic support at the moment. So as I said, there are people like me that provide speech and language therapy for adults with DLD, and I do that in a number of different ways. I do one-to-one speech and language therapy, which isn't like traditional sort of speech and language therapy, but a lot of it is really about self-understanding and self-advocacy. you know, like all late diagnoses, it takes a lot to get your head around when you have a diagnosis and you reassess your life and you think about, you know, how you could improve your quality of life in the future, and really understanding that and having the confidence to get your language and communication needs met and adapted to is a challenge. So people often need a lot of support around that. And we do also work on strategies. You know, no adult with DLD has got to adulthood without strategies, clearly. But sometimes those strategies can be adapted, you know, fine-honed, and that, you know, we can work on that. I also run communication support groups. So for not everyone, but for a lot of people feel very understandably isolated in their diagnosis, just like they felt isolated as they were growing up, because the reality is, because of the lack of diagnosis, you're really pretty unlikely to have met somebody else with DLD. So there's an ongoing feeling that you're the only one. And actually, it can be incredibly supportive to meet other people that have DLD. You know, for some people that really works. So I run very small groups where we get people together and we talk about the sort of issues that come up during the week, and they help each other and I support them. And we're working on similar sort of things around self-advocacy and, you know, self-acceptance and strategies, but they're also, you know, helping each other, and just having that continually affirmed, really, that there are other people. It's not just you. There are other people that really struggling with very similar things and similar feelings, you know, is really influential for some people. Some people prefer to communicate in a less sort of in-person kind of way. So last year we set up a Facebook group which is specifically for adults with DLD to message each other, talk to each other, bring up issues, and share experiences in a sort of safe kind of environment where it's just for them, either if you have DLD or you think you might have DLD. So that's the Facebook group, Connecting Adults with DLD. Just to say that also, as part of the other sort of things that I support with as part of therapy are helping people make sense of paperwork. You know, what you were talking about, applying for access to work, might be about helping people to complete forms, but it might also be about making sense of the written information that they have been given. So we haven't talked much about that other side of things. So people with DLD really often struggle a lot with their reading comprehension. So making sense of what they read, but also expressing themselves in writing. So those sort of things are areas that I give help with. And as I say, I can be employed as a coach, a workplace coach, through Access to Work. And the other side of what I provide is advocacy. So sometimes, no matter how much you sort of help people with self-advocacy, in some situations it just helps to have someone who's got your back, and it helps you to get your message across. So, I mean, that's what I provide. I can't tell you what other speech and language therapists provide. Hopefully, maybe some similar things. So the other services, in terms of other services people can access in general, as I say, Access to Work, you can apply for Access to Work if you have DLD. As you know, you don't even have to have a specific diagnosis to apply for Access to Work, but definitely people can. That's the sort of number one. The DSA, Disabled Students Allowance, you definitely can get that. In theory, because DLD can be seen as a disability in terms of the Equality Act of what a disability is, in theory, people with DLD can sometimes get access to other services that are for people with disabilities, but it's not always easy and it's not always recognised as such. Some employment, sort of employability type services will give support to adults with DLD, but it's very patchy. And in terms of benefits, you know, people with DLD, as you can imagine, have a massive amount of trouble getting access to things like PIP. I've just recently worked with somebody who's had a DLD diagnosis or the equivalent since they were 3, and could not, and got a 0 rating for their communication on their PIP assessment. So
wow,
yeah.
Yeah. So it makes it even more important, really, the fact that there is this out there, but like you said, it's patchy, and in some cases, you know, if you're really unlucky in terms of where you are and your maybe particular presentation and experience of DLD, you might have nothing available to you. So it makes it really important for workplaces and people more broadly in our society to understand what we can all do, perhaps knowing or not knowing that someone has DLD. So yeah, would love to hear from you, like what can people do to make it easier for people with DLD in general in terms of how they communicate or different ways of doing things at work or outside of that as well?
Absolutely. So, I mean, in general, the sort of things that really benefit people with DLD, they're not complicated, but they do take a bit of effort, because none of us, it doesn't come easily to us, I think, to adapt to the way that we communicate. You know, I do it day in and day out, and I have to think about it all the time, you know. So you might have the best with the, you know, have a very good intentions, but it is quite difficult to get yourself to do it. So when it comes to things like, one of the first things that I say to people is pause more. And that's just not something that comes very naturally to us. But if you pause, you know, so it's not really a question of sort of talking more slowly, although talking very fast can be problematic for people with DLD. I think a lot of it is just because you're saying more. Obviously, the faster you talk, the more you're going to say. But just stopping really regularly, you know, every few sentences, it just gives people time to catch up with their processing. Because otherwise, what they're doing is they're trying to understand what you said like a couple of seconds ago, but you've carried on to the next bit and they're still thinking about that bit, so they're going to miss a bit of the next bit, and then by the time you get onto the third thing, they're going to have forgotten what the first bit was anyway, and they probably will have remembered half of the second bit, and then what are they going to have left to take in the third bit? Whereas if you just paused after the first bit, well, they took that in and caught up, and then the second bit builds on that first bit, hopefully, and you know, it just gives people more time. But in general, just saying less, you know, like don't, you know, trying to keep your sentences a bit shorter, you know, just really can help. Just reducing time pressure on people to either to like take in what you've said, or so don't expect an immediate response, but also giving time for people to formulate what they want to say, and realizing that is going to take time. Visual support is hugely important. People with DLD, like a lot of people with neurodevelopmental conditions, are often very visual, and they take information in better visually. So anything that you can provide in terms of photos, videos, bit of drawing, you know, any kind of images, symbols, you know, I always put, you know, icons and symbols on all the things that I write, really increase people's access to what you're saying. And particularly things like demonstrations, if you can just show them how to do something rather than telling them how to do it, that makes a huge difference. Also giving examples, so saying something but then giving them some examples of what you mean, that can really open up the door to understanding. And finally, I'd say just you were talking earlier, Jess, about really that we need to listen to people to really understand what it is they need. And as I say, people with DLD are often quite self-aware and will be able to tell you what they need, but often nobody asks them, or they don't really listen to the response. So really listening to them, believing them that they do genuinely have those difficulties, however they might seem on the surface, and you know, that sort of recognition can just be so supportive for people. And that's in any situation. That's, you know, at work, but also in families, in friendships, and definitely in health settings.
Yeah, definitely.
I don't know if you wanted me to say more about things that can help it, you know, at work, but
well, I mean, it would be really helpful, I think. But just one of my reflections as you're talking is so many of the things that you have said would help not just people with DLD, but people with other neurodevelopmental differences, but not even just those people, but everybody as well.
People, yes, just people.
Who is not going to benefit from people giving us a little bit more time to process and think? And you're so right that it doesn't come natural to all of us. And this, I say this all the time. I'm so pleased that you've said it as a speech and language therapist. As a neurodiversity consultant, I'm not perfect. I'm learning about this too. Like, I'm going to get things wrong. But the really key things that I'm doing are what you've just said: listening to people, believing what they're saying, and trying my best to change how I do things to better everybody. So, you know, for all the people in organizations or in families anywhere, really, if your heart is in the right place and you have the right intentions, you're like 80% of the way there. You're not going to get this perfect, but don't let that stop you from doing anything. Because I see a lot of the times people not have the confidence and think, oh, I'm going to get it wrong. I don't really know what to do. And the other thing I just want to say on reflection was around the slowing down that we all, I mean, I talk really quickly. I know I do. I really have to think about it.
Yeah.
But speaking to some teachers recently who were saying that, you know, they use Makaton in their classrooms, which I'm a massive advocate for. If people don't know, Makaton is like a type of kind of signing that is used and has huge benefits for not just people with language disorders, people who are deaf, people whose first language isn't English, people who have, you know, loads of different reasons. But they were saying as teachers, one of the great things for them is, if you're using Makaton, you have to slow down your speech because you're having to remember what the sign is. You're having to actually do the sign as well. So it has this amazing benefit of just forcing people to slow down, which is so important.
Absolutely. And other ways of doing that, you know, if you were illustrating a bit of what you were saying and you were thinking, oh, I've just got to do a bit of little drawing here, or do a bit of a quick diagram or where I'm making some note, or I'm just going to make some written notes of what I'm saying, that's going to slow you down too. You know, all those things, like you say, have a very useful function. And I just wanted to add as well, like you said, when people feel perhaps anxious that they're going to get it wrong, you know, the thing is, you're right, we can't all set out and you know, we might set out to get it right, but you're not going to get it right because that's not natural to you. So it's like, give yourself a break there. What you can do is just try to keep an eye on yourself. So it's like, oh gosh, yeah, I really said a lot. Like you were saying, oh, I noticed I spoke really fast there, or wow, I just asked that person 3 questions in a row. Just go back and do it again and do it better. You know, that they'll appreciate that so much, and you'll get a much more effective response.
That's such a good point, I think, because and one I talk about a lot. If you just acknowledge it and then do it differently, that's better than just brushing past it and thinking, oh God, didn't get that right, let's plow on. You're not expected to get everything right. So I think that acknowledgement and then talking about it and resetting is really good.
You know, and people with DLD, like, you know, that they know that it's very hard to get things right in communication. They're going to be very understanding about that, but they'll really appreciate the fact that you've made an effort to do it in a way that makes things more accessible to them.
Yeah, exactly. People just want to be heard, don't they? Even if it's not going to be right for them. And as you were talking just before we close out, I imagine that kind of the interviews that are, you know, such a core part of how everybody does assessments for jobs. Unfortunately, I don't agree with it. I think there's lots of different ways we could do it. But some of the things that you mentioned, I imagine that are useful is people seeing the questions in advance, which we know are really helpful for other neurodevelopmental differences as well. Maybe having a copy of the questions in the interview, I imagine, or being given the option to do it in person, as you talked about before. What are the other things maybe that employers can think about to make that process better?
Yeah, I mean, certainly all those things, you know, perhaps being allowed to bring in notes in terms of, like, you know, what we were talking about, scripting, you know, being not like, you know, so that it's not a test of your memory, basically. And like when you're under stress, all those things are going to, you know, have a tendency to go out the window, what you wanted to say. So being able to take in notes, being given the questions plenty of time in advance. I mean, people come back and they say, oh yes, I got the questions, but it was like half an hour before. You know, that just isn't enough time for people to even understand the questions, let alone prepare an answer. I think just realizing what a pressurized situation is, just giving people more time to take in the question or to respond, And a really key thing, I think, for people with DLD is not being judged on the way that you sound. So actually, that there may be a whole load of experience and understanding and knowledge that you can't demonstrate very easily in that sort of situation. But and so not to assume from the way that you sound that's a reflection on what you know and understand, and what your experience is. So making sure that you give people other ways of demonstrating that.
I think that
and don't do it on the phone.
Don't do it. Yeah, totally. But I think, I mean, that's such a great place to end, because again, I talk about no judgment in a really big way. It is the key to neuroinclusion, really, because just so much of what we do is we've normalized certain ways of doing things, certain ways of sounding, certain ways of speaking, moving, being professional. And if we lost all of that as a society, it would just unlock things for so many people. And that's what we can all take individual responsibility for. We can't change everything in the world, but we can change how we feel about people, and not need to understand why they sound like that or why they've said it in that way before we can take a step back and think, does it matter? No, I'm just not going to judge. So thank you so much for joining me. I found it fascinating, as I'm sure has come across. But before we end and say our goodbyes, where can people find out more about DLD? You've mentioned a few things as we've gone through, but what can we leave people with so they can kind of carry on learning?
Yeah, I mean, there's no specific place to go to for information about DLD in adults, but the best place to start is the YouTube channel for Raddled, which stands for Raising Awareness of DLD. There's a massive range of videos on there, both interviews with parents, professionals, people with DLD, which you'll learn the most from. There's a video that I helped to make with Lily Farrington in 2020, which I believe is the only video that's specifically about DLD in adults, but you get a lot of adults with DLD talking on that, and that will tell you more information about that. So that's the best place to start if you want to find out information about DLD. There's a really good organization. It's an Australian organization, but it's linked up with Raddled, and it's called the DLD Project. There are lots of really great podcasts on there and some really good resources about DLD. And a lot of these organizations, which have been specifically interested in children and young people up until now, are starting to get more involved in providing information about DLD in adulthood. There's AFASIC, which is AFASIC, which is the organization that supports people with DLD and their families. So there's a lot of support for parents on there, and sort of parents of getting towards parents of young adults. And there's my own website, which I'd be really happy to hear from anybody that is wondering if perhaps they might have DLD. Just get in touch for a chat about that by email or phone. And you'll see some information about the sort of services that I provide. But as I said, there's the Association of Speech and Language Therapists in Independent Practice. And what you can do there is you can find a therapist. So you can look for adult DLD, and you can look for your geographical area, and then you can narrow it down to people that provide support with that in your area, and contact any of those. So hopefully that will be a good start anyway.
Lots to keep going with. And yeah, I encourage everybody to check out those resources and to check out more about what you do. I've absolutely loved it. You're doing amazing work. And as you know, me and my family will be forever grateful for finding Rachel. You have helped us enormously. And so I really do appreciate you taking the time today to answer all of these questions about DLD and share your wisdom. So thanks so much for coming along. And I'll speak to you soon.